Welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you are new. My name is Hallie and I'm so happy that you're here. If you are new, hi, welcome. I have ADHD and I have recently unlocked a new special interest, that being classic literature and the juicy backstories behind the books and authors. As many of you already know, I started reading again as an adult in like November of 2023, and since then I've tried to really branch out and read all different kinds of books, all different genres of books, just to try and figure out what my taste in books is, what I like in books, what I dislike. And one genre that I am yet to try is classic literature, mainly because I was always extremely intimidated by classic books. Obviously, like I said, I have ADHD, so sometimes I have a really hard time paying attention while reading books or just finding books that can keep my attention or that interest me enough. And I also think that I always just steered away from classic books as well for fear of not being able to understand what I was reading and it making me feel dumb, to be completely honest. I consider myself a very normal person and probably a pretty average reader. I don't have like a degree or background in literature or anything fancy like that. And I overall just have a lot going on in my life as an ADHD mom of two. So I think all those reasons combined, I always just kind of steered away from classic literature and kind of figured that I would never be the type of person to even be interested in a classic book. But a few months ago, a TikTok popped up on my For You page, and it was this girl telling the backstory of Mary Shelley, who is the author of Frankenstein, and I thought it was so interesting. And honestly, seeing that TikTok kind of unlocked a forgotten fact about myself, that I really love learning the backstories behind things and people and how things came about. Like, I've always found that so interesting, and that for me ended up being really all I needed to remove a very large portion of that intimidation factor, as funny as it seems. That really just opened up the world of classic literature to me, and since then I have truly just hyperfixated on all things classic literature, the authors, the backstories, the books people love and hate. I have just fully engrossed myself in the world of classic literature, and since then I have kind of compiled my 25 book beginner classic TBR. How I tried to choose these books were basically by three things. One, I needed to be very interested in the storyline and plot of the book. Obviously, like I've mentioned already multiple times with ADHD, I really have to let myself mood read because I like physically cannot get myself to read a book that I am not interested in. It is extremely hard and also just not enjoyable. So I really try to just let myself mood read and find books that just truly sound interesting to me and not just books that I want to read just to read them, if that makes sense. Two, I tried to look for books where there was a large majority of people who recommended them as beginner friendly, either for their readability, their relatability, or just their length, because a huge part of the intimidation factor for me with classics was the fear of not being able to understand what I'm reading. So finding books where a large majority of people recommended them as being beginner friendly really helped kind of remove that extra layer of intimidation. And three, some of these books on my TBR, I actually heard an interesting fact about the backstory of the author or the book itself first, and then after being intrigued by the author themselves or the backstory of the book, I looked into the plot of the book and realized that it sounded like something I was very, very interested in, and I added them to the list because of that. So I feel like that's kind of the three things that I was trying to focus on when picking books for my 25 book beginner classic TBR. So with all that being said, in today's video, I'm going to be going over the 25 books that I added into my personal beginner classics TBR. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what each book is about and also the juicy backstories behind the books and authors themselves. I really hope this video helps you find some new classics to put on your TBR, or if you're like I was and you feel like classic literature is very intimidating and you don't think that you'll ever be able to get into classics, I hope that this video helps kind of remove some of that intimidation factor for you as well, and maybe we can start our classics reading journey together. I think that would be so fun. So without further ado, the first genre of classics that I want to get into are sci-fi classics, and I felt like it was only right to start it off with the book that started it all for me, which is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Frankenstein, I feel like, is a pretty widely known story, but this book is about a scientist named Victor Frankenstein who is obsessed with creating life. So obsessed that he begins scavenging through graveyards to gather material to create a new being with. He's eventually able to successfully shock the monster to life using electricity, but he is instantly horrified by his own creation. Frankenstein Frankenstein's monster, being rejected by his own creator and also society, sets out to destroy his creator and all that he holds dear. So I feel like this is going to be a very interesting story. I'm really excited to read a lot of these classics that are like really well-known stories, but I've never gotten like the full scope of the story, especially because with Frankenstein, I feel like it's really popular for people to think the monster's name is Frankenstein and not the doctor who created him. So I feel like that is already just like so interesting that that is something that kind of gets lost, even though it's such a popular story, if that makes sense. This book was published in 1818, but it was written in 1816, which is historically known as the year without a summer. If you're like me and you're like, what is the year without summer? Basically, in 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted, and it released so much ash and sulfur that it essentially covered the sky and prevented sunlight from reaching the earth for an entire year. The skies would often appear dim or like a dirty yellow color, and people described summer days that often felt like fall or even winter, which is so crazy. It is one of the most powerful volcanic events in recorded history, and it was so big that it caused issues all around the world. In Britain, France, Germany, and Switzerland, there was persistent cold, rain, and darkness, which led to failed crops and in turn famine, which of course caused food prices to skyrocket to the point where there was what were called bread riots in the streets. And then in New England and Canada, there was snow falling in June and July, and the frost from that snow ended up killing crops like corn and wheat, and that actually led to one of the worst famines in US history as well. So all of that is connected. That's all going on while Mrs. Mary Shelley is writing this book, which is actually crazy, but it all ties in. So in the summer of 1816, amidst all of this crisis that's going on from the volcano eruption, Mary Shelley, who was at the time 18 years old and still Mary Godwin, took a trip to Villa Diodati, which, if you don't know, is like a historical mansion in Switzerland. Also, pause. I am going to be referencing all of the notes that I typed out because there's so much that I like really want to talk about and say, and I don't want to forget anything. So if you see me kind of looking to the side, that's what I'm looking at, just so that I make sure that I get all of the names correct whenever I'm telling you everything, because I will very quickly lose the plot if I don't reference what I wrote down. Anyway, so she went with Percy Shelley, who was a radical romantic poet and also Mary's lover, who she would later marry, Lord Byron, who was another poet, John William Pilladori, Lord Byron's physician and also an aspiring writer. Lastly, there was Claire Clairmont, who was Mary Shelley's stepsister and Lord Byron's lover, which I was laughing whenever I was looking this up because I was like, it's literally like a little couples trip, a little couples retreat, plus John is just like the third wheel. So one evening while on the trip, they sat around the fire and read aloud from a book of German ghost stories called Phantasmagoriana. Lord Byron felt so inspired by the stories that they read that he proposed that they each write their own ghost story as a way to pass the time, since they were stuck inside due to all of the weather issues that were going on from the volcano eruption. All ties together. So a few days after the competition had started, Mary Shelley had a waking dream, which when I looked it up, the difference between like a nightmare and a waking dream is, I guess a waking dream is just like a little bit more vivid and like intense than a nightmare, I guess. But she basically dreamt of a scientist who reanimated a corpse and was terrified by his success, which of course went on to be her inspiration for the story Frankenstein. So this was the first classic that I heard where it was inspired by like a nightmare. As I looked into classics more, I feel like is pretty common, at least in like this sci-fi horror genre of classics, where the author will have gotten the inspiration from a really terrifying, intense dream, which is honestly so crazy that just a dream can inspire a book that has lasted throughout such a long time. I did see a bunch of TikToks also, this is like a side note, but I did see a bunch of TikToks talking about how Mary Shelley is like the OG gothic baddie, because apparently her and Percy Shelley went on a bunch of dates in graveyards, specifically the graveyard where Mary Shelley's mother was buried, and it's rumored that that is where they very first did the deed, was on top of her own mother's grave, which is crazy. I also heard something about how after she died, they found Percy Shelley's heart wrapped in like letters or poetry or something like that, and she had saved it in her desk or something like that. That's crazy. That's actually crazy, and it makes so much sense that she would write a story like Frankenstein after being inspired by a nightmare, especially if those things are true. So that's the first book that we have, is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. The next book that I have is The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. So this book is set in 1898 London, and it follows the events after an alien invasion. So this book was published in 1898. It's one of the first books to follow the alien invasion kind of storyline and timeline that we still know today, because up until the point that this book was published, there were other books that kind of included other beings or like aliens from other worlds, but none of them had gone into like the full-blown invasion storyline where like the aliens are attacking Earth and they have super advanced technology and they're basically taking the planet over. So that's really why this book is seen as kind of like groundbreaking and has had a huge impact on the sci-fi genre as well. A little fun fact about this book is after it was published, they decided to do a live radio broadcasting where they read the book, and people were so convinced that it was real that there was hysteria in the streets. People were freaking out because they were convinced that this alien invasion that was being broadcast on the radio was genuinely happening in real life, which is so crazy to think about, like being in that time period and just like listening to the radio and all of a sudden you're convinced like, oh my god, it's actually happening. And especially it's not like the alien invasion storyline was like a super popular thing back then, you know, so hearing that for the first time and thinking that it's real would be absolutely insane. And one of the reasons that it was so believable was because it uses a lot of the scientific facts and evidence that were available at the time. So the way that the takeover happens and the way that everything happens in the book was seen as very, very plausible and realistic as to something that could happen in real life, which I think is so interesting as well. And I've heard a lot of people talk about this book and how it does a really great job at showing just how different people react to extreme situations. And I've heard multiple people describe this book as almost like a study of human interest because of that. So that's The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. I'm really excited to read this one. I feel like that's going to be so interesting, especially just knowing the fact that people heard it and were taking it in as if it was like actually happening. I feel like reading it almost through that perspective would be really, really interesting as well. The next book that I have is The Slaughterhouse Five by Kurt Vonnegut. So this book is really interesting because it's kind of semi-autobiographical and it follows a man named Billy Pilgrim's journey being unstuck in time after experiencing life-changing wartime horrors and also surviving the bombing of Dresden. So it obviously includes huge topics on like PTSD and trauma, especially from like wartime trauma. So a little bit of backstory on Kurt Vonnegut. He was in the army himself and actually fought in World War II. And then during the Battle of the Bulge, he was actually captured by German soldiers and became a prisoner of war. During his time as a prisoner of war, he was kept in an underground slaughterhouse/meat locker that was actually called Slaughterhouse Five. He then went on to survive the Dresden bombing himself, like our main character, by taking shelter underground with the other prisoners of war. Which also, side note, the Dresden bombing, because I did not know this, the Dresden bombing is one of the deadliest bombings to occur in history. So it wasn't like a small bombing that he survived. It was like a catastrophic bombing that he survived. So after experiencing all of this, obviously all of his wartime experiences severely traumatized him. He went on to spend years attempting to write about his experiences, but he really just struggled with trying to depict the horrors that he experienced and witnessed. That was until he had the idea to tell his story through the lens of science fiction, satire, and non-linear storytelling. He really wanted to convey like the madness and also the meaninglessness of war. And this book, when it was published, had a lot of cultural and political significance because it was published in 1969 during the Vietnam War. So I'm really, really interested to read this. This one is a tiny bit intimidating to me just because like it's told in like a non-linear way and it's following a character who's literally unstuck in time. So I think that this book like is kind of chaotic to read because it's a little bit all over the place, but that was like the point when it was written. So I'm very, very intrigued by this one, but still a little bit intimidated. This will probably be one that I read a little bit later later on into my classics journey, but I just thought the premise was really interesting. So that's Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut. Okay, so those are the 3 sci-fi classics that I have on my TBR. Moving on to Gothic classics. For the first one, I want to play a little bit of a word association game. So like when I say sky, you say blue, okay? When I say vampire, you say, I bet you said Dracula, didn't you? Well, let me introduce you to Carmilla, Carmen's version. This is a gothic, sapphic vampire horror, and it is actually known as the origin of the female vampire. And it was originally written as more of a gay cautionary tale. However, a lot of people have now reclaimed the story as being an amazing sapphic vampire romance. So I wanted this version specifically because this version is edited by Carmen Maria Machado, who a lot of people say does a really good job at taking away from the original intent meant by Le Fanu by bringing a lot of the sapphic romantic undercurrents of the book back to light through her footnotes and also in her introduction, which I did read her little introduction as well, and it was so good already. And for me, this specific version of the book and Carmen's reasoning behind wanting to edit the book as well hit a lot harder after I found out that after Le Fanu died, there were letters that were found in a hollow wall in his office study, and these letters were between an unnamed man and a woman addressed as V, and along with the letters there was also a handwritten introduction to the book Carmilla in Le Fanu's handwriting. So very quickly 2 and 2 were put together that the story of Carmilla was not entirely based in fiction. It seems like the 2 main characters, Martin Hesselius and Laura, were largely based off of the real Dr. Peter Fontenot and Veronica Housel. I hope I'm saying that right. And Carmilla herself was found to be inspired by a real-life woman named Marcia Marin. So although, yes, like this is fiction, he was writing a story in a way about real people. She took the opportunity to kind of edit the book to bring it new life and not only help the readers enjoy the story from a more feminist perspective, but also to take away from the narrative, don't be gay or else bad things will happen to you. Another fun fact about this book is that it heavily inspired a lot of the themes, characteristics, and the Countess Dracula herself in the book Dracula, which would come out 25 years later. So very interesting. Also, I just realized I forgot to tell you what this book was even about. So this is a gothic novella that follows our main character Laura. She lives in a secluded castle deep in the forest with her father, and one day after a carriage accident happens in town, a mysterious woman named Carmilla comes to stay with her and her father. Laura and Carmilla quickly form a very deep and intense bond. But as the time goes on, Laura finds Carmilla's behavior increasingly strange, and soon women in nearby villages begin dying from a mysterious illness. That is our first little gothic classic. The next book that I have is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. This book is set in Victorian London. We're following our main character, Dr. Jekyll. He's a very respected scientist and gentleman, and he's very fascinated with the idea that every single person holds both good and evil within themselves. He starts to dive deep into experimentation, and soon people start to meet Mr. Jekyll's new friend, Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde seems to appear out of nowhere and is seen by society as being violent and secretive. This causes Dr. Jekyll's friends and family to be very worried about his relationship to this suspicious man. The backstory for this is so, like, I was like, so, this is another one that was kind of inspired by a nightmare. Robert Louis Stevenson originally wrote this book during a 6-day writing fever. He claimed that the inspiration for the story came from a nightmare that he had while he was sick and bedridden. In that dream, he said that he saw 2 specific scenes. One where Dr. Jekyll drinks the potion and turns into Mr. Hyde for the very first time, and another where he saw the brutal murder of a man by Mr. Hyde. So, remember how I said that he wrote this book in a 6-day writing fever? Well, he actually originally wrote the entire first draft of this book in just 3 days, but after giving it to his wife, Fanny Stevenson, who was known to be a very tough critic and editor for reviews, she ended up hating it so much that she suggested that he threw it into the fire. And he did. He threw the entire first draft of the book into the fire, and then he proceeded to spend another 3 days, still sick and bedridden, rewriting the entire thing, and that is the version that we have today. Crazy. Another fun fact about the book is that it is widely believed that the inspiration behind the characters Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde came from a real-life man named William Bronte. William Bronte was a very successful and well-known man. He was a very successful cabinet maker and also a deacon, which I looked it up, and it's basically like the head chairman of the Edinburgh trades, which meant that he also had a seat and a prominent role in the town council. So he was living a very comfortable life. But there was another side to William Bronte that no one knew about. He was secretly involved in burglary and theft, and he led a secret criminal life. At night, he would go out and commit crimes with a group of thieves, like robbing wealthy homes or even places that he would do business. And because of the fact that he was very well respected and had really good connections as well, he was actually able to hide his criminal activities and prevent ruining his perfect public persona for a really long time. His criminal activities were eventually exposed, and he was arrested and sentenced to hang in 1788. So, super interesting backstory. I still just can't believe that the wife was like, throw it in the fire, it's so bad. And then he did. Like, he did. He listened to his wife. And he wrote this book twice in 6 days. Like, that's crazy. The next book that I have is Dracula by Bram Stoker. I'm so excited to read this, especially having kind of the backstory of Carmilla and how that influenced some of the female vampires or like vibes of this story as well. So this story actually, which I didn't know, is told through various letters, journal entries, and newspaper clippings, which I thought was really interesting. I did not know that about this book. In this book, you're basically following a cast of characters who is trying to come together to fight off an evil and unravel a mystery. That's all I know about it. Pretty much everybody who is recommending like beginner classics though, like they say that Dracula is one that you have to read, especially for like gothic classics and gothic literature. So I'm really, really excited to give it a try and see how I like it. So a little bit of backstory on this book. There is speculation that the name Dracula came from Vlad III Dracula, who was also known as Vlad the Impaler. Crazy name, I know. He was a 15th century ruler known for his cruelty. People think that he found his name in a library book, but didn't know much about his actual history. He just used the name, I guess. I don't know. It's also said that a few of the other books that kind of influenced this story is Carmilla, of course, The Vampire by John Polidori, and Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which I think is really interesting because 2 out of those 3 books that kind of influenced this story were authors who knew each other. If you remember from when we talked about Mary Shelley, although John Polidori published his novel, The Vampire, 1 full year after Mary Shelley published Frankenstein. So they weren't published at the same time, but I do think it's really interesting that they're both in that list. So anyway, people have also speculated that Bram Stoker was inspired by Jack the Ripper because his crimes in 1988 had created a kind of hysteria in society around there being a hidden evil in respectable society. So those are a couple little fun facts about Dracula. The next book that I have is The Uncensored Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I specifically wanted to get the uncensored version. I was kind of going back and forth between getting the Penguin Classics one, but I ultimately decided that I wanted to have the full uncensored version of this book, and I think I'm really going to be happy with that decision. So the synopsis for this book says, enthralled by his own exquisite portrait, Dorian Gray exchanges his soul for eternal youth and beauty. Influenced by his friend Lord Henry Wotton, he is drawn into a corrupt double life, indulging his desires in secret while remaining a gentleman in the eyes of polite society. Only his portrait bears the traces of his decadence. I think that that sounds so interesting. A little bit of backstory on The Picture of Dorian Gray and Oscar Wilde. So it was originally published in 1890, but the version that was published in Lippincott's monthly magazine was edited without Wilde's consent. The editor and publisher cut and altered multiple passages because they wanted to remove the homosexual and homoerotic undertones and also to censor sexual relationships that were deemed too vulgar. They also just wanted to soften the content that would be perceived as immoral, like Dorian's decadent lifestyle and the influence of aestheticism. I think I'm saying that right. aestheticism, which I had to look up what aestheticism was because I did not know that. Aestheticism is a artistic or literary movement that held the belief that artists exist independently of morality or usefulness. The purpose of art was to be beautiful, not to teach morality or politics, which is where the term art for art's sake comes from, which I did not know that, so I thought that was very interesting. So essentially these edits were made because the publisher and editor were afraid of the backlash that they would receive because there was such strict moral standards at the time. And despite all of the edits that were made, this book still caused outrage for its immorality whenever it was published, which is just crazy. So I'm really, really excited to read this one. And I'm really glad that I got the uncensored version because in the uncensored version, they put back in the parts that were taken out or edited from the original work. So very excited. The next book that I have is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And the copy that I have actually has a couple of other stories within this one. So I think The Yellow Wallpaper is literally like this much of the book, but it's kind of exciting that I'll have some other stories as well to read after if I like it. This one actually Marky read in school and he said it was really, really good. So I looked into it and oh my gosh, the backstory is kind of crazy. So the story is inspired by her own experience with postpartum depression and mental illness and the treatment that she received. The story follows a woman who is suffering from a nervous condition and is taken to a quiet country house by her husband, who is also her physician. And she's prescribed the rest cure. And there we witness her growing obsession with the yellow wallpaper that is in the room and basically her slow descent into psychosis, which is crazy. Like I said, it's inspired by Charlotte Perkins Gilman's actual own experience with postpartum depression and her treatment for mental illness because she herself was prescribed the rest cure. So what is the rest cure even? Like, what is it? Basically, it was a treatment that was commonly used on predominantly women who were suffering from nervous disorders. And when you're prescribed the rest cure, women must be in isolation on bed rest for 6 to 8 weeks, have no intellectual stimulation, they can't do any writing, reading, or work, and go on a high-fat, high-calorie diet that often consisted of large quantities of milk and meat. It sounds like torture, okay? So the treatment, of course, did not help. It actually did the opposite and almost drove her to the point of having a mental breakdown, which not surprised. But yeah, she wrote this story based on her own experience with the rest cure and basically being locked in isolation like you're in a psych ward for having a nervous disorder. So very, very, very excited to read this, especially because Marky has already read it and he said that it was really, really good. So that's The Yellow Wallpaper. After that, I have The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. I just know I'm saying that wrong. Please don't come for me. So the synopsis of this book says, beneath the opera house, a faceless menace is waiting. For years, there have been rumors of a ghost haunting the vast, dimly lit labyrinth underneath the Paris Opera House. One that wreaks havoc if anything displeases it. When the new managers of the theater ignore their predecessors' warnings about keeping the Phantom of the Opera happy, it is a fatal mistake. Tortured by unrequited love for the beautiful angelic singer Christine Day, the mysterious masked figure living underground has been awaiting a chance to strike and take its revenge on the world. Will the Phantom claim its prey, or will Christine see beyond its hideous appearance? That sounds so good. That sounds so interesting. And honestly, this one has a really interesting backstory as well. The inspiration from the story came from the Palais Garnier. And I just know I'm gonna say so many of these names wrong. I just bear with me. So the Palais Garnier was a lavish Paris opera house, and it was rumored to be haunted for multiple reasons. One, the previous opera house, Salle La Pelletier, I'm so sorry. The previous opera house, though, it had burned down in 1873, and it had killed one of the ballerinas and left her husband, who was the pianist, permanently disfigured. Two, there was an incident with a chandelier where the chandelier's counterweight fell during a performance in 1896 and killed a concierge. Three, there's a literal lake underneath the Paris Opera House. That's kind of crazy. I was like trying to look up pictures because I was like, no way, there's like a full-blown like lake under there, but no, there is. is. So that's not fiction. And 4, there is a legend that a stagehand had gone missing from the opera house, and it is rumored that they were last seen descending into the basement levels of the opera house before disappearing without a trace. And these are all like real life rumors, so people think that all of those rumors kind of led to the inspiration for the Phantom of the Opera. I'm really excited to read this one. I think that it's going to be really good. I have high hopes for this one. Okay, next up we have none other than the Bronte sisters. Who are the Bronte sisters, you may be asking? The Bronte sisters are 3 writers, Charlotte, Anne, and Emily Bronte. They were born into a very large family, and there was 6 children in total, who all ended up living pretty short and honestly tragic lives. To give you a little bit of the backstory on the lives of the Bronte sisters, in 1820 the family had recently moved to a new home when their mother, Maria Bronte, fell ill and died. She died in 1821, presumably of ovarian cancer. Unfortunately, the tragedy did not stop there, because just 5 years after the death of their mother, the oldest Bronte sibling, who was also named Maria, ended up dying from tuberculosis at the age of 11. And just 1 month after that, Elizabeth Bronte, who was the second oldest sibling of the Bronte kids, ended up passing away from tuberculosis as well. Yeah, crazy. Mom dies, sister dies, another sister's gone. What's going on? So the 2 oldest siblings died at 11 and 10 of tuberculosis. The mom has died at this point 5 years ago from ovarian cancer. And at this point, there are 4 Bronte children left. Obviously, the 3 Bronte sisters and their brother. The oldest now being Charlotte, and then Branwell, their brother, and after that, Emily, and Anne is the youngest. They grew up living with their father and also their aunt on their mom's side, who had come to live with them to help raise them after the death of their mother, and also just like the tragedy of 2 of their siblings dying as well. Their father, Patrick Bronte, was known to be really strict. He was a very intellectual man. He was religious, but he was emotionally distant. He gave his kids free range to explore their ideas and creativity, and he highly encouraged reading, writing, and also the discussion of serious topics. All 4 of them were homeschooled, and they all had access to a huge home library that was full of classic literature. The 4 of them would create worlds that they would use to practice their writing and also like workshop different ideas that they had. And the stories that they would write that were based on these worlds were very elaborate, and they would actually write them into tiny little manuscripts. Because of their very early introduction to grief and the fact that they lived so close to a graveyard as well, they were constantly reminded of like the reality of death. And that really contributed to like the gothic and melancholy undertones of their books. They grew up living a relatively secluded life, and they heavily relied on each other to be each other's critics, reviewers, and collaborators, but they had a extremely close bond. The Bronte sisters originally published a collection of poems in 1846 under male pseudonyms. Charlotte used the name Currer Bell, Emily used the name Ellis Bell, and Anne used the name Acton Bell. They paid out of pocket for 1,000 copies, and in the first year, only 2 sold. So it mostly went unnoticed by both the public and critics. And the few reviewers that did comment on it reacted with confusion and criticism because of the collection's dark themes and unsettling tones. But even though their collection of poetry was not instantly successful, it did help the Bronte sisters in gaining some of the confidence that they needed in order to go on and publish their novels. 1 year after they published their collection of poems in October of 1847, Charlotte published Jane Eyre under the name of Currer Bell. It was an instant success, and it really established her like fame in the literary world, but as Currer Bell, I guess. And then 2 months later, Emily published Wuthering Heights under the name of Ellis Bell. And then the last sister to publish was Anne Bronte. She published The Tenant of Wildfell Hill 1 year after both of the other sisters published their books. She originally published this book under the name Acton Bell, of course. This book, when it was published, was a huge success, but it wasn't long before tragedy struck again. In September, so just 3 months after Anne had published The Tenant of Wildfell Hill, Branwell Bronte died at the age of 31, presumably from, can you guess it, tuberculosis, that was likely worsened by ongoing substance abuse and alcoholism. At this point, the entire family is getting taken out by tuberculosis. It's crazy. But wait, it doesn't stop there. Just 3 months after Branwell Bronte died of tuberculosis, Emily Bronte also died at the age of 30 from tuberculosis. And as if it couldn't get any worse, just 5 months after that, Anne Bronte also got tuberculosis and died at the age of 29, which left Charlotte Bronte as the last of the Bronte children to survive. She did go on to publish one more novel during her lifetime, Villette, under the name of Currer Bell, but she didn't live much longer. She ended up dying 2 years later in March of 1855 at the age of 38 from pregnancy complications. Her last novel, The Professor, was actually published 2 years after her death. So although during their lifetime there was a lot of speculation as to who the authors of these novels really were, the Bronte sisters didn't actually reveal their true identities as authors until 1850, where in the 1850 edition of Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey, Charlotte included a biographical preface under her real name where she confirmed that Ellis and Acton Bell were actually her sisters, Emily and Anne Bronte. And that was the first time that their identities were formally disclosed to the public. A fun fact about the Bronte sisters that is really not a fun fact. I mean, it's a fun fact, but it's crazy. After all the Bronte siblings had died in such a short period of time, I mean, it was literally one after another, their father actually sent someone to investigate their deaths. And it was soon discovered that the town that they lived in had an abnormally high mortality rate compared to some of the other towns nearby them of similar size. In the town that they lived in, 41.6% of the town's inhabitants died before the age of 6. And the average age of death in the town was 25.8 years old. The investigator found that there was not nearly enough bathrooms in the town for the amount of people that were living there. And the bathrooms that they did have were extremely dirty. 2 bathrooms in particular that were used by a dozen families were perched in the street, and it would often overflow into the street where a water tap sat just 2 feet away. But also, there was a graveyard that sat on a hill right in front of the Bronte estate. The investigator found the graveyard to be poorly organized, overfull, and poorly oxygenated. So much so that the decomposing materials from the graves had filtered into the town's water supply. And the long-term exposure to the bacteria would have made the Brontes weaker, shorter, and more susceptible to other diseases. Crazy. I know. So a lot of people say that it's romantic irony that the Bronte sisters, being such moody, gothic, literary queens, essentially died from drinking corpse water. That's crazy. That's why I'm it's a fun fact, but it's also just not, not fun. It's just a fact at that point. But anyway, so to get into the 3 books, I thought it was only fitting to choose one book from each of the sisters to start off with. For Charlotte Bronte, I chose Jane Eyre. The synopsis for this one says, orphaned as a child, Jane has felt an outcast her whole young life. Her courage is tested once again when she arrives at Thornfield Hall, where she's been hired by the brooding, proud Edward Rochester to care for his ward Adele. Jane finds herself drawn to his troubled yet kind spirit. She falls in love hard, but there is a terrifying secret inside the gloomy, forbidden Thornfield Hall. Is Rochester hiding from Jane? Will Jane be left heartbroken and exiled once again? That sounds very interesting. Very excited to give this one a try. And then from Emily Bronte, obviously, I'm going to read Wuthering Heights, as it's her only novel. A lot of people frame this as a romance, but from what I have gathered, I think this is more so a cautionary tale on domestic abuse and toxic relationships, because while there are a ton of really beautifully written quotes on love between the 2 main characters, really them and their relationship at its core is just toxic and tragic. So I'm gonna go into it with that mindset. And then lastly, by Anne Bronte, I have The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. The synopsis of this one says, Gilbert Markham is deeply intrigued by Helen Graham, a beautiful and secretive young woman who has moved into nearby Wildfell Hall with her young son. He is quick to offer Helen his friendship, but when her reclusive behavior becomes the subject of local gossip and speculation, Gilbert begins to wonder whether his trust in her has been misplaced. It is only when she allows Gilbert to read her diary that the truth is revealed and the shocking details of the disastrous marriage she has left behind emerge. Very, very excited. I'm honestly really excited to read all the Bronte books because I feel like I will like them. Hopefully. That's the Bronte sisters. Honestly, an iconic trio. The next book that I have is The Master and the Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. I'm so sorry if I'm saying that atrociously. The synopsis of this one says, one hot spring, the devil arrives in Moscow, accompanied by a retinue that includes a beautifully naked witch and an immense walking, talking black cat with a fondness for chess and vodka. The visitors quickly wreak havoc in a city that refuses to believe in either God or Satan, but they also bring peace to two unhappy Muscovites. One is the Master, a writer, pilloried for daring to write a novel about Christ in Pontius Pilate. The other is Margarita, who loves the Master so deeply that she is willing to literally go to hell for him. That sounds so interesting. So this is actually a Russian classic. This book blends fantasy, magical realism, satire, and supernatural fiction, which is so interesting. The author of this book actually served as a doctor during World War I and the Russian Civil War. And after experiencing the horror of war, he turned to literature and theater. But because he was living under the Soviet rule during Stalin's regime, his writings were either censored or just banned altogether because his plays would often mock bureaucracy and dogmatism, which essentially means closed-mindedness and resistance to change. But because Stalin himself personally really liked one of his plays called The Days of the Turbans, he protected him from arrest but still wouldn't allow most of his work to be published. He started writing The Master and the Margarita in 1928, but ended up destroying the entire first draft 2 years later during a moment of despair over all of the censorship that he was experiencing. He eventually secretly restarted the book and continued writing until just before his death in 1940. The manuscript for the book was later smuggled out and published decades after his death. It was originally heavily censored, but later it was published in full. So interesting, and the synopsis for this just sounds really interesting. Like, I'm very intrigued. So that's The Master and the Margarita. The last Gothic classic that I have to talk about is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. The synopsis for this book says, in Monte Carlo, our heroine is swept off her feet by the dashing widower Maxim de Winter in his sudden proposal of marriage. Orphaned and working as a lady's maid, she can barely believe her luck. It's only when they arrive at Manderley, her husband's cavernous estate on the Cornish coast, that she realizes how vast a shadow his late wife, Rebecca, will cast over their lives, introducing a lingering evil that threatens to destroy their love from beyond the grave. This, I believe, is kind of like a psychological kind of thriller type of vibe, which I think is so interesting. And honestly, the backstory of this book made me even more interested in the book as well. So, Daphne du Maurier came from a very successful literary and theatrical family. Her father was a famous actor, and her grandfather was also a successful actor and punch cartoonist. She started writing at a very early age and really quickly came to be known for her gothic, suspenseful, and psychological writing style. She spent a lot of her life growing up in Cornwall, which heavily inspired the tone and atmosphere for her books. And the book Rebecca was actually inspired by her own marriage to a military officer. Her marriage made her feel insecure and inferior, and she felt a lot of jealousy towards her husband's ex-fiance, who had tragically died by throwing herself in front of a train. She had discovered a letter from the ex-wife where she had written her name with a very bold letter R, and she started fixating on the idea that she was so sophisticated and so beautiful, so much so that it inspired her to write the story Rebecca, a story about a deceased wife haunting the house. She was heavily inspired by Charlotte Bronte's gothic tone, and she admired how the Bronte sisters' writing gave so much emotional depth to their characters. And she really wanted to explore themes of jealousy, identity, and the different power dynamics within relationships. I feel like this sounds so interesting. I think it's crazy that it was inspired by her jealousy over her husband's dead ex-fiance. Like, that's crazy. So yeah, I'm excited to read this. I feel like this would be a fun one to read in like October or November. Moving on to historical fiction, I have what I think is the longest book on my physical TBR for classics, The Count of Monte Cristo. Don't let it scare you, okay? It's gonna be okay. So the synopsis of this book says, thrown in prison for a crime he has not committed, Edmond Dantes is confined to the grim fortress of If. There he learns of a great hoard of treasure hidden on the Isle of Monte Cristo, and he becomes determined not only to escape, but also to use the treasure to plot the destruction of the three men responsible for his incarceration. It's basically a giant story about revenge. Everyone that I see talking about this book basically says, this book makes me realize that I'm not hating to my full potential. And another thing that I see about this book when people talk about it, because it is so long, it was originally published serially, which means that it came out slowly over the course of, I think it was like a year or maybe 2 years or something like that. Okay, yeah, it was originally published in 18 parts over the course of 2 years. So people say that although it is long, it almost reads like you're watching a TV show, because when it was being published in the magazine, each of the parts of the book kind of had to end on a little bit of a cliffhanger, or things had to kind of come to a close or have have some type of resolution and things like that to keep people like engaged in the story and coming back over the course of the full 2 years. So they say that it reads really quickly because of that, because you're just constantly being sucked back in, and it just feels like watching a TV show, which I find really interesting. A little bit of a backstory. First of all, this author also wrote The Three Musketeers, which that's crazy. I didn't know. I thought that was a fun thing. Whenever I found that out, I was like, that's so cool. Another fun fact is that Alexandre Dumas's father was actually the first black general in the French army, and he was a hero of the French Revolutionary Wars. But his father ended up dying when Alexander was only 4 years old, which led him to grow up in poverty despite his father's success. But that was ultimately what led him to pursue a career in writing. He faced a lot of racial prejudice and was often mocked by his peers, but he didn't let that stop him. He began with writing plays that would frequently be turned into novels and also serialized in the newspaper, and people loved his writing. He was very successful and very well known. Like I said, this book was actually originally published serially in 18 parts over the course of 2 years, and although it is fiction, this, kind of like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is actually inspired by a real-life case of wrongful imprisonment. Alexandre Dumas was known for doing a ton of historical research for his writing, and he would find a lot of inspiration for his plot lines and characters in historical documents. So one day while he was doing research for some of his writing, he discovered a book called Archives de la Police, which basically contained a bunch of different true crime stories and case files, all from the Napoleonic and post-revolution era. And among those stories was the case of a shoemaker named Pierre Picaud. I don't know how to say it. The case of Pierre Picaud followed a man who was betrayed by his friends, imprisoned on false charges, and who eventually took revenge after finding treasure. So literally, like, the premise of this book. That's very cool. Definitely the thing that intimidates me about this one the most is just the length. I don't really worry about like understanding it or being entertained by it, but that is this big girl. I think she's literally the biggest one on the TBR for sure. After that, I have East of Eden by John Steinbeck. And a lot of people describe this book as just being an amazing description of what it means to be human and feel emotions and struggle with morals and family and relationships and also generational trauma. This book is essentially like a retelling of the story of Cain and Abel from the Bible. Although it's a retelling, from what I have gathered, you don't really need the knowledge of like the story of Cain and Abel. You just know that it's like a retelling of Cain and Abel. But yeah, I don't really know too much else about this book. Basically what persuaded me to read it was all of the raving reviews for how moving it was and how beautiful of a description it was of just like the human experience and living life and feeling emotions. And that sounds like something right up my alley because I love deeply emotional and just moving things like that. So that's ultimately why I decided to pick this one up and add it to my TBR. That's basically what I have to say about this one. There wasn't really like any juicy gossipy backstory for this one, but I just thought it sounded really good and it has potential to be a book that I really enjoy. Moving on to more so like general fiction, I guess is what the next section would be. I have 2 books from Mrs. Jane Austen. I have Pride and Prejudice and Emma. I feel like these are 2 very well-known classics. A tiny little backstory on Mrs. Jane Austen. She grew up in rural England and began writing as a teenager and was very encouraged by her father and the rest of her family. Her first novel, Sense and Sensibility, was originally published with the phrase "by a lady," and her name didn't actually appear on any of her books until after her death. Instead, each book that she published from then on would just say "by the author of," and then the title of whatever book was like previously published. Also, there's speculation that some of the characters in her books, mostly the unlikable characters, were based off of people in her family or social circle that she didn't like or who annoyed her, which I just think is so funny. Starting off with Pride and Prejudice. So this was actually Jane Austen's second novel, and I feel like this is the most talked about book, at least that I have seen, of Jane Austen's works. There's speculation that a man named Thomas Lefroy and his short but very emotional relationship with Jane Austen was the inspiration for Mr. Darcy's character. Jane and Thomas met in December of 1975 when she was 20 and he was 19. Thomas was in town to go to school to become a lawyer, and he was staying with one of Jane's father's relatives. They were seen dancing together multiple times at local balls throughout the Christmas and New Year's season. They ultimately only interacted for for a couple of weeks, and whatever relationship they did have very quickly came to an end and was cut short when Thomas was abruptly sent away by his family. People suspect that the reason his family sent him away and separated him from Jane was because although he was in school to become a lawyer, he was still very financially dependent on his family, and Jane's family didn't have a dowry, inheritance, or social leverage to offer really. So they didn't see her as a suitable match for Thomas, and they didn't want him marrying a poor clergyman's daughter with nothing to offer, since at the time, marrying simply for love only ever rarely happened. Jane's brief experience with Thomas Lefroy is widely considered as the closest that she ever got to experiencing real romantic love. And there are a lot of people who think that she always gave her characters happy endings in her books because she never got one herself. So sad. So just 10 months after Thomas Lefroy's departure, Jane started writing Pride and Prejudice, which at the time was originally going to be called First Impressions. She finished the first draft for the book under that name almost 1 year later in 1971 at the age of 21. That's crazy that she wrote this at 21. Like, that's actually insane. The book, however, was immediately rejected by the publisher without even being read at all, and was not published until 1813 when Jane was 37 years old. That's just so crazy to me. Also, a kind of sad fun fact, Jane Austen never went on to marry, but Thomas Lefroy eventually did go on to marry and have a daughter. And you know what he named his daughter? He named her Jane. I know, it's so tragic. Yeah. Another fun fact, in the 2005 movie adaptation, there's a scene where Keira Knightley is reading a book, and she's actually reading First Impressions, which I think is so cool. It's like such a fun little Easter egg. Also, speaking of movie adaptations, while I was like looking up stuff about Jane Austen, I stumbled upon this movie called Becoming Jane. I highly recommend watching it. It was so good, and a lot of people really believe that it's a really accurate depiction of what Jane Austen's life really would have been like, and it was so good. I cried like a baby at the end. It was so good. I highly recommend watching that as well. Moving on to Emma, the synopsis of this one says, beautiful, clever, rich, and single, Emma Woodhouse is perfectly content with her life and sees no need for either love or marriage. Nothing, however, delights her more than interfering in the romantic lives of others. But when she ignores the warnings of her good friend Mr. Knightley and attempts to arrange a suitable match for her protege, Harriet Smith, her carefully laid plans soon unravel and have consequences that she never expected. That sounds so good. Like, that honestly sounds like tea. So this is actually Jane Austen's fourth book and the last book that she published in her lifetime. Her last two books were published after her death. The thing that originally drew me to this book was I saw a TikTok and the girl was like, if someone would have told me that this entire book was just pure gossip, I would have picked it up sooner. And to me, that immediately piqued my interest. I am, after all, just a girl, and I hate to admit it, but I do love a little bit of gossip, a little sip of the steaming hot tea, if you will. And then once I started looking into the book even further, I found Jane Austen's famous quote where, when talking about Emma and her inspiration for the main character, she said, I'm going to make a heroine whom no one but myself will much like. And I just think that's so funny, honestly. Like, her whole purpose in making this was like to make a character that everyone will hate. Like, that's so funny. And it's about gossiping. Like, I love it. And because of that, a lot of people credit this book for helping shape the like imperfect but lovable character. And a fun fact about the book Emma, of the many Jane Austen movie adaptations that I did know of, one that I did not know was like a modern day adaptation was Clueless. So I just thought that was so interesting. I've never seen that movie, but that makes me want to like watch it after reading the book so I can see like where the inspiration came from. Those are my two Jane Austen books. The next book that I have is Little Woman by Louisa May Alcott. This is another one that I feel like I see talked about so much on TikTok as a very beautiful coming of age story. The synopsis of this book says, this beloved tale follows the four March sisters living in a small New England community. Meg, the oldest, is pretty and wishes to be a lady. Jo, at 15, is ungainly and unconventional with an ambition to be an author. Beth is a delicate child of 13 with a taste for music, and Amy is a blonde beauty of 12. The story of their domestic adventures, their attempts to increase the family income, their friendship with the neighboring Lawrence family, and their later love affairs remains as fresh and beguiling as ever. I do think it's really cool because the book is split into two parts. So in the first part you get like their younger lives, and in the second part you get their adult lives, which I'm really excited because you get to see kind of the whole timeline, if that makes sense, of like all of the sisters and stuff. And I love stories about sisters to begin with because I have 3. So it always makes me a little bit emotional reading stories about sisters. So a little bit of a backstory on Louisa May Alcott and Little Woman. Louisa May Alcott was raised in a very intellectual family. She had 3 sisters, and her father was a man named Branson Alcott. Branson Alcott was a transcendentalist, philosopher, and educator. I had to look up what a transcendentalist was because, again, I had no idea what that meant. Basically, a transcendentalist is someone who believes in the inherent goodness of people and nature and the importance of intuition over logic and societal norms. Transcendentalism was really progressive for the time. Branson Alcott was one of the first American educators to push for education through discussion rather than memorization, respect for each individual child's personality, and the importance of physical education, art, and play as forms of education, which I feel like eats. Transcendentalists were often critical of organized religion and the government, believing that they were corrupt. And many transcendentalists were also abolitionists. So I don't know. They sound great to me. As amazing as all this sounds, sadly his beliefs on education were far ahead of the time, and his schools ended up failing financially and shutting down. He was a very smart man, but just not good with his money, so his family ended up living in poverty. Because of this, Louisa May Alcott started working at a very young age. She had jobs like being a teacher, a seamstress, and later in life, she was actually a Civil War nurse. She also wrote gothic thrillers, which I was so surprised to find out because that is like not the vibe of Little Woman at all, but she wrote gothic thrillers called Blood and Thunder Tales under pen names like A.M. Bernard to financially help out her family. Which, if you're like me and you're like, what the heck are Blood and Thunder Tales? Because I read that and I was like, what does that mean? Like, what is that? Basically, Blood and Thunder Tales are a type of action-packed and melodramatic stories that were really popular. It's basically like the book equivalent of like an old school action movie. They were full of emotion, danger, revenge, and strong, dangerous woman. No one knew it was her who wrote those stories until after she died. So even though they lived in poverty, her father still had relationships with very influential philosophers, and they would often have meetings at their house. So Louisa May Alcott grew up around a lot of prominent radical writers and reformers. She was even later in her life tutored by Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, who were both very famous philosophers, and Margaret Fuller, who was a very influential women's rights advocate, which is really crazy to think about because I feel like that's the same thing as saying like, oh, well, who was your tutor? And just casually being like, oh, just Einstein. My dad knows him. That's crazy. So, years later, after volunteering as a union nurse and contracting typhoid fever, she ended up being treated with mercury and her health was permanently damaged. She continued trying to write, but she just didn't see very much success. She was about to give up on writing altogether when she was approached by her publisher and asked to write a book for girls. She was initially actually against it because she didn't like girls or girlhood and had never liked or really knew any other girls besides her sisters, which is so ironic hearing that now and knowing how much of a success this is and how it's like stood the test of time on being like such a good story for like girlhood specifically is just like so ironic. So she eventually did agree to write the book, of course, and she drew her inspiration from her own mom and sisters and wrote the book in just 2 months, which is crazy. So yeah, like I said, this book has 2 parts. First, you have Little Woman, which follows them in their childhood, and then the second part, Good Wives, and it follows the sisters into adulthood. So that is Little Woman. I'm really excited to give this one a try. I'm pretty sure the opening scene is like on Christmas in this book, so I kind of want to read this in like December, maybe towards the end of November. But yeah, that's Little Woman. The next book that I have is White Nights by, I honestly can't say his first name, but Dostoevsky. Can say his last name, and I'm very proud of it. This is just a teeny tiny, like the tiniest little book, but whenever I was seeing quotes from this book on TikTok, I was like, yeah, I'm gonna have to read this. So this book essentially is about 2 very lonely people who meet one day and bond over their shared feelings, which on the surface I feel like sounds very simple and just seems very simple, but I feel like this is really going to dive deep into the characters' emotions, and I really love that in books, so I think I'm going to really enjoy enjoy this. Whenever I was researching different classics and trying to find classics to add to my little TBR, Dostoevsky is one that kept coming up time and time again. And to be completely honest, this is probably the only one of his books that doesn't intimidate me at this current moment. I do think eventually down the road I'll read some other Dostoevsky books, like Crime and Punishment is probably the most popular one that I've seen people mention and like rave about, but for some reason his like full-length novels just really intimidate me still, so I'm gonna start off with this cute little tiny guy instead. And I'm honestly fine with it because people frame this book as being one of the most endearing love stories ever with unparalleled yearning. Genuinely say less. So obviously that caught my attention as a lover of romance and intense yearning, and I'm really excited to read this and form my own opinion on it, because the more that I looked into this book, the more that it seemed like half the people love this book because it's like a beautiful and romantic and tragic love story, and the other half of the people love this book because they say it is less a love story and more the story of an extremely lonely man who just longs for love and connection so badly that as soon as he receives kindness and compassion, he romanticizes it and almost like disconnects from reality. And a lot of people see this book more as a cautionary tale about escaping into your own fantasies and idealizing love too much. So I'm really excited to read it and see for myself what it's all about. The next book that I have is The Stranger by Albert Camus. I don't know if it's Camus or Camus, but I feel like Camus feels more accurate than Camus. Anyway, The Stranger. On the back of the book, this says, through the story of an ordinary man who unwittingly gets drawn into a senseless murder on a sun-drenched Algerian beach, Camus explored what he termed the nakedness of man forced with the absurd. So this is a book that has what's called absurdism, which again, I did have to look up because I was like, girl, what is that? Absurdism in literature is a literary movement and philosophical stance that explores the conflict between humanity's inherent desire for meaning and the apparent meaninglessness of the universe. It acknowledges the human tendency to seek order, purpose, and reason while simultaneously highlighting the chaotic, illogical, and often nonsensical nature of reality. Absurdist works often feature characters in situations where their actions or the world around them lack inherent meaning, forcing them to confront the inherent contradictions of existence. So essentially, accepting that there is no meaning to anything and still choosing to live regardless and just embracing that fact, kind of. And I feel like even just from the first few lines of this book, you can really start to get a sense of the character's lack of emotion or care for the situations that are going on around him. The book starts off by saying, Maman died today, or yesterday maybe. I don't know. I got a telegram from home. Mother deceased. Funeral tomorrow. Faithfully yours. That doesn't mean anything. Maybe it was yesterday. I'm really excited to read this, honestly. I feel like it's going to be very like thought-provoking and like deep and meaningful. So really excited to see what absurdism is all about. Also, I almost forgot. This is why I'm glad I have my little notes in front of me. Albert Camus was raised by his illiterate mother after his father died in World War I. He was attending college and studying philosophy, but he had to drop out because he had tuberculosis. He later went on to become a journalist and a playwright, and he was part of the French resistance in World War II. He eventually won the Nobel Prize in 1957, and at the time he was 44 years old, which made him one of the youngest recipients to ever receive a Nobel Prize at the time, which I just thought was really interesting. So that is The Stranger by Albert Camus. The next book that I have is Orlando by Virginia Woolf. I'm so excited to read a Virginia Woolf book. The synopsis of this one says, a playful and exuberant romp through history as seen through the eyes of a character whose life spans 3 centuries and 2 genders. As a teenage nobleman, Orlando spends his days in revelry at the Tudor court of Queen Elizabeth and his nights in writing earnest poetry. 2 kings later, Orlando is sent to serve as ambassador to Constantinople, where he awakens one day to find himself in the body of a woman. The Lady Orlando takes this circumstance in stride and returns to England, where she engages in love affairs, consorts with the famous poets of each age, finds happiness with an unconventional husband, and at last achieves publication of her own epic poem in the year 1928. I feel like that premise is so interesting. First of all, like the fact that Orlando wakes up one day as a woman and then just like continues going on with life, like that is so interesting. This is actually a semi-biographical book inspired by Virginia Woolf's passionate love affair with a woman named Vita Sackville West. Vita Sackville West was a successful English author, poet, and journalist, and also Virginia Woolf's close best friend and lover. The story takes place over the course of 300 years, and it explores gender identity, sexuality, the treatment of men versus women throughout time, and also female autonomy. And a little fun fact, Vita Sackville West's son later said, Orlando is the longest and most charming love letter in literature. That is just so cute. I'm also really excited to try a Virginia Woolf book as well, because I know that she's known for her stream of consciousness style of writing, and I'm really excited to give that a try and see if I like that style of writing. The stream of consciousness style of writing is basically when an author tries to capture a character's continuous and unfiltered train of thought and feelings. I have written down that the goal is for the writing to mirror the way that thoughts occur in real life as closely as possible. So I feel like I will really like that. Of course, I'm not sure, but I have high hopes. That is Orlando by Virginia Woolf. The next book that I have is The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. The premise of this book is so interesting. So the synopsis on the back of this one says, this is the story of traveling salesman Gregor Samsa, who wakes one morning to find himself transformed into some sort of monstrous insect. I cannot wait to read this and see what is happening. A little bit into the backstory. Franz Kafka was a German-speaking Jewish writer who worked as a bureaucrat during the day and a writer at night. Throughout his life, he experienced anxiety, self-doubt, chronic illness, and isolation. He had a complicated relationship with his father, who was very critical and also emotionally distant. He was chronically ill, and he mainly struggled with, can you guess it? Tuberculosis. It's not funny, it's just insane how many times tuberculosis is brought up in these backstories. It's actually crazy. I never realized how big of a thing it was until I was looking into all of these, and it was tuberculosis, and also tuberculosis. But anyway, he was also seen as an outcast because he was a German-speaking Jew in a city where most of the people spoke Czech. So because of all of these things combined, he really saw himself as a failure and a burden to others. He really struggled with his mental health. He felt trapped at his job, which he hated, but he had to stay because he was the main breadwinner, and his body was slowly deteriorating due to the tuberculosis, which only added to his feelings of being an inconvenience to the people around him. And all of these things that he felt and experienced in his real life, isolation, being a burden, family pressures, and mental illness, those are all themes that he wrote into this story, which I am really excited to see how he wove that into the story. This is also another example of absurdism, but this also has themes of existentialism as well. And a little fun fact about Franz Kafka, he was very conflicted about his own writing. He even asked his friend to burn all of his unpublished manuscripts after he died, but his friend ignored his wishes. He was also very against the actual insect that the man turns into ever being depicted, because he wanted the horror of the insect itself to stay as abstract as possible, which I thought was really interesting, because I feel like a lot of times authors want a visualization of the monster or the creation or whatever they're telling the story about, but the fact that he wanted to just leave it up to people's imagination, I thought was really interesting. So that is The Metamorphosis. The next book that I have is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is actually the only book on this list that I have technically read before because it was required reading in high school, but when I tell you I have zero recollection of anything about this book, I don't think I was paying attention literally at all. So I'm excited to read it as an adult and actually pay attention to what's going on. The only thing that I remember about this book is a light, a green light or something like that, but I don't even remember what that's referencing or when it happened, why it happened, when we saw it. I don't know. So very excited to read this as an adult. The synopsis for this book says, when Nick Carraway moves to West Egg, Long Island, he has no idea that the mansion next to his modest house is home to Jay Gatsby. Soon thereafter, Nick becomes a close confidant to the ostentatiously wealthy Gatsby and is pulled into his neighbor's regular schedule of riotous parties that draw revelers from the hot monde of New York City. No one knows how Gatsby came by his extravagant wealth, but then nobody really seems to care. That's pretty much what I remember. I've seen the movie. I don't know, I just have no recollection of the story. I don't know why, so I'm really excited to read it. Honestly, when looking into the backstory of F. Scott Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby, I was not expecting to find very much, but what I did find was a little bit shocking. So there's actually a lot to this story that was actually inspired by F. Scott Fitzgerald's real life and like people that he actually knew. He was born into a family that was really struggling financially, and from a young age, he was obsessed with status and class. His ex had left him later in life for a richer man, which was his inspiration for one of our main characters, Daisy. He was heartbroken and he never really fully got over her. He later proposed to a woman named Zelda Sayre, and she almost turned down his proposal because he still hadn't seen very much success in writing. She only agreed to marry him after he published his debut novel, and it was so successful that he essentially became rich and famous for it overnight. And that really added to his feelings of only feeling loved if he is successful and not for like himself as a person. Later on, after The Great Gatsby was published, it wasn't really a success, and F. Scott Fitzgerald actually died believing that the book was a failure. Zelda would also publicly mock the book because she was upset that when she read the book, she recognized passages that sounded awfully familiar to things that she had written in her own journals. When the book was published, she wrote a review that says, "It seems to me that on one page I recognized a portion of an old diary of mine." She was really upset about him essentially stealing her personal writing and turning it into fiction, which honestly, valid. Like, I would be upset too. Zelda later suffered a mental break and was diagnosed with schizophrenia, which many scholars believe was a misdiagnosis for bipolar. She spent the next few years in and out of mental hospitals, with some of the stays being voluntary, but many of them being arranged by F. Scott Fitzgerald and her doctor. Their relationship was very toxic and abusive. F. Scott Fitzgerald had become an alcoholic. When he would drink, he would become erratic and cruel. And they would very often end up having very loud public arguments because of this. Zelda wanted to become a writer herself, and he would often dismiss her talent and accuse her of trying to compete with him. He would tell her doctors not to let her write because it would make her more sick, but then would submit her writings to magazines without her permission, and also used parts of her diary for his own writing without her permission as well. In the end, F. Scott Fitzgerald died at the age of 40 from a heart attack. He died believing he was a failure and being mostly forgotten. His funeral was basically empty and only a few people attended. And Zelda died 8 years later in a fire at one of the mental hospitals that she was currently staying at. So very tragic ending, very tragic story. I had no idea about any of that, and I was not expecting that whenever I started to kind of look into F. Scott Fitzgerald and the backstory and the history and all that stuff, but very insane, tragic, toxic, all the things. But excited to read the book, excited to read it as an adult and see if I enjoy it, because I have no recollection of reading it as a teenager, and I don't know if that's just because I did not care or if it's because I didn't enjoy it. I'll never know. And then the last book that I have on my little starter TBR is The Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. I'm so excited to read this. Mark's actually the one that told me about this. He was telling me about something else that was inspired by this book, and I was like, that sounds so good. So I looked into it. This one I'm a little bit intimidated by simply because it's just like one long poem, but I found this copy at Half Price Books, and whenever I found it, I sat down to just like try and read it and see how it went, and honestly, it wasn't as confusing as I was expecting it to be, so that made me feel better about it. On the back of the book, it says, "The comedy tells the journey of a character who is at one and the same time both Dante himself and every man through three realms of the Christian afterlife: hell, purgatory, and heaven." So it's essentially, we're following our main character down into the depths of hell, I guess, and then like up to heaven. I don't know, but I'm really excited to read this and see what it's about, especially because there's so much today that is like inspired by the story. I was talking to my cousin about it, and there's so many even like artists, like Hosier, he has an entire album that is like inspired by Dante's journey into hell, apparently. So I think it would be so interesting after reading this book to also like listen to that, or just like find different things that were inspired by this story and see if I can find like where they pulled inspiration from, because I just think that's so cool. Like, art is so beautiful in that way where you like are inspired by one piece, and like creating an entire music, for example, because it's an entirely different medium than like this book, and especially how old this book is, because it was written in between 1308 and 1320 and published in 1472. Like, that's so long ago, and the fact that something written so long ago can inspire like modern day art and music and TV shows, and like that's just so cool to me. So anyway, I don't really have that much on a backstory behind this one because it is so old, and I don't think there was any like tea or drama or anything like that. So just to give you like a quick little backstory, the few things that I did find. Dante Alighieri was a Italian writer who lived in a city called Florence. In his early life, he was active in politics, but later the city of Florence became became full of political unrest and was essentially at war within itself. Eventually, he found himself on the losing side and ended up exiled. He spent the last 20 years of his life wandering through different Italian cities and landscapes, all while writing the Divine Comedy. His feelings of isolation and betrayal heavily inspired his writing. That's pretty much all I have for this one. I'm really excited / nervous to get into this one. With that being said, those are all 25 books that I have on my little beginner classics TBR and the juicy backstories behind them. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. I hope you found some new books to add to your classics TBR, or if you were intimidated by classics, I hope that you found some that feel more accessible or make you want to maybe try out a classic and get into the genre. I think it would be fun for us to kind of start our little classics reading journey together if you're like me and you have never read a classic just yet. But I'm excited. I'm excited to start getting into classics. I think I'm going to make specific classic reading vlogs, so if you're interested in seeing me read these classics specifically, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss those videos if you are interested. Also, if you have some other classics that you think are pretty beginner friendly, or based off of these, if you think that I would like them based off of like my current taste. I know I haven't read any of them yet, but these are all ones that I feel like sound really interesting. So if you have any other recommendations for classic books for me, leave them down in the comments. Maybe I'll find some to add to my little list, because I already have like a running list of like 20 more classics that I would like to get and read once I get through this initial TBR of mine. But that's pretty much I have for today's video. I'm ready to stop talking because I've been recording all day. There was just so many things I wanted to talk about with you guys. So I hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!